Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be diving deep into the story of Theranos.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating story. A Silicon Valley startup that promised to revolutionize blood testing, but as we'll see, things weren't quite as they seemed.
Yeah, a lot of twists and turns, and some pretty incredible characters too. So to get us started, can you give us a little background on Theranos? What were they trying to do?
So Theranos had this really ambitious goal, right? They wanted to create a technology that could run hundreds of blood tests using just a tiny finger prick sample.
Wow, so no more big needles.
That was the idea, yeah. Less blood, faster results. They really thought they could change the whole healthcare industry.
I mean, that sounds incredible. No wonder investors were so excited about it.
Absolutely, yeah. But there were some problems from the very beginning, technological problems for sure. Like even John Carreyrou, one of the co-founders, admitted that the early device, the Theranos 1.0, was kind of a crapshoot.
A crapshoot, like they weren't even sure it would work.
Well, not reliably at least. He often used his own blood to demo the device to investors, but even he knew it wasn't consistent.
Wow, so red flags right from the start, basically.
And it wasn't just Roy who had doubts. Henry Moseley, the first CFO, started raising concerns about the company's revenue projections. They seemed way too optimistic, and they didn't have any contracts with pharmaceutical companies.
So some serious questions about the business model as well.
Right, and instead of addressing these concerns, Theranos just kept pushing forward, shifting their focus to a new device called the Edison.
Okay, so the Edison, was this the device that was supposed to solve all the problems?
Well, that's what they hoped, but things got even more complicated. Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO, she was obsessed with Steve Jobs and Apple. She wanted the Edison to be sleek and stylish, like an Apple product.
Ah, so prioritizing looks over function.
Yeah, and that created some real tension. She brought in Anna Ariola, a former Apple designer, to help with the aesthetics.
So someone who really knew how to make things look good.
Exactly. But Ariola quickly realized that Elizabeth's obsession with design was coming at the expense of practicality. She wanted the device to be smaller and smaller while also demanding more tests.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Ariola who was worried. Avi Tavonian, a former Apple executive who was on Theranos' board, he also started questioning Elizabeth's leadership. He was concerned about her control over the company.
So even people with close ties to Apple were seeing red flags.
And despite all this internal turmoil, Theranos managed to land some really big partnerships. They got a deal with Walgreens to offer their blood tests in their stores.
Wow, that's huge. How did they pull that off?
Well, Elizabeth was incredibly charismatic. She managed to convince Dr. Jay Rosen, a Walgreens executive, that this was the future of healthcare.
But I imagine there were still some concerns, right? I mean, given all the secrecy and problems we've talked about.
Oh, absolutely. Even during those initial meetings with Walgreens, there were signs of Theranos' paranoia. Walgreens execs were closely monitored whenever they left the conference room.
Seriously.
Yeah, and Kevin Hunter, another Walgreens executive, he noticed that there was no visible lab at Theranos headquarters. He asked about it, and they just gave him vague answers.
That seems like a pretty big oversight.
You'd think so, right? But the Walgreens deal went through anyway. And it wasn't just Walgreens. Theranos also partnered with Safeway, the grocery chain.
So they were really gaining momentum.
They were, but behind the scenes, the problems were just getting worse. The workplace culture at Theranos became incredibly toxic.
Toxic in what way?
Employees who questioned anything, the technology, the leadership, they were intimidated, sidelined, even fired.
Wow, so a culture of fear, basically.
Yeah, like Greg Menschel, a senior engineer, he raised concerns about the technology and was basically forced to resign.
And what about this incident with John Tolbert? I read about that.
Oh, right, yeah. John Tolbert was a warehouse worker who reported a car accident involving some Theranos consultants. Sunny Balwani, the COO, actually threatened him for reporting it.
Seriously, just for reporting an accident.
Yeah, it shows how deep the paranoia ran within the company.
And on top of all that, Elizabeth starts bringing in her brother's friends from college to fill key positions.
Right, the so-called frat pack. These were people with no real experience in the field, but they were fiercely loyal to Elizabeth.
So a recipe for groupthink and bad decisions.
And the pressure on the engineers to deliver results was immense. Elizabeth was demanding unrealistic deadlines, ignoring all the warnings about the mini-lab's problems.
So it sounds like everything was set to implode. We'll have to wait till next time to find out exactly how that happened. Join us for part 2 of our deep dive into Theranos, where we'll uncover the truth behind the company's stunning downfall. So last time on the deep dive, we talked about all these warning signs, right? The doubts about the technology, the toxic work environment.
Yeah, a lot of people were raising red flags, but they were being ignored, or worse.
And now we're going to find out what happened when Theranos was getting ready to launch, right? Like with the mini lab and everything.
Right, so the mini lab, this was the device they were betting everything on. And as they got closer to the commercial launch, the problems with it became impossible to hide.
What kind of problems are we talking about?
Well, big problems with quality control. The tests they were running on the mini lab, the results were inconsistent, unreliable.
So how could they even think about using this on actual patients?
That's the thing, right? The lab personnel, they knew the technology was flawed, but they were under immense pressure from management to use it anyway.
So like a real ethical dilemma.
Absolutely. And one of the people who really struggled with this was Tyler Schultz. She was a young Stanford grad who joined Theranos, I think, really believing in the mission.
But he started seeing what was really going on.
Yeah. He saw firsthand the quality control failures, and he tried to raise concerns, but Sunny Balwani, the COO, basically shut him down.
Well, I told him he didn't know what he was talking about.
Pretty much. And Schultz wasn't alone. Erina Chung, another lab worker, she also saw problems and felt pressured to keep quiet.
It's incredible how these people had the courage to speak up, knowing they could lose their jobs.
Yeah, it takes a lot of guts to go against that kind of pressure, but both Schultz and Chung, they eventually decided they couldn't stay silent, and their decision would ultimately play a huge role in bringing Theranos down.
So they were the whistleblowers.
Yeah, you could say that, and what they helped reveal was even more shocking than anyone imagined. Theranos, the company claiming to have revolutionized blood testing, was actually using modified Siemens analyzers for a lot of their tests.
Wait, so they were using traditional blood testing machines?
Exactly. The very technology they claimed to be disrupting, that's what they were relying on behind the scenes.
It's just mind-blowing, the level of deception.
It really is. But, things were about to start unraveling even further, and that's where John Carreyrou comes in. He's the Wall Street Journal reporter who really broke this story wide open.
I remember when those articles came out. It was huge.
Yeah, Carreyrou got a tip from a former Theranos employee, and he started digging, and he faced a lot of pushback from the company. Legal threats, intimidation, the whole 9 yards.
Theranos really tried to shut him down.
Oh, they did. But Carreyrou, he was determined to get to the truth, and he had some crucial sources inside the company, too.
Like Alan Beam, right? The lab director?
Yeah. Beam had become increasingly disillusioned with Theranos, and he was really troubled by what he was seeing. He knew he was taking a big risk by talking to Carreyrou, but he felt he had to do it.
And then, in October 2015, Carreyrou publishes that first article in the Wall Street Journal.
Right, and it was like a bomb went off. The article laid out all the details, the problems with the Edison, the misreading claims, the silencing of employees.
And people finally started paying attention.
Oh, yeah. Regulators launched investigations, lawsuits started piling up, the Walgreens partnership fell apart. It all happened so fast.
So Theranos was basically finished at that point.
Pretty much. Elizabeth Holmes tried to deny everything at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. And then, of course, the criminal charges came.
Yeah, that's a whole other chapter, but we'll have to save that for next time. Join us for part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the fallout from the Theranos scandal and the lessons we can learn from this incredible story. Okay, so we left off with Theranos basically imploding, right? Like after that Wall Street Journal article, it all just fell apart.
Yeah, it really did. I mean, the fallout was pretty massive. Federal agencies like the SEC and the CMS, they launched investigations, and then you had all those lawsuits from investors and patients.
And I remember the Walgreens partnership just completely dissolved, right? Like overnight.
Oh, yeah, it was over. And, it really shows the power of investigative journalism, right? I mean, Carreyrou's reporting, it had a huge impact, but also the whistleblowers, people like Tyler Schultz and Erina Chung.
Yeah, those folks really put themselves on the line.
Absolutely. Without them, who knows how long Theranos could have kept up the deception.
And what about Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani? What happened to them after all this came out?
Well, they were both eventually charged with multiple counts of fraud. The trial was a big deal. It went on for months.
I remember following it. There were so many twists and turns.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. I mean, all those details about how they misled investors and put patients at risk, it was pretty shocking stuff.
So what was the verdict?
In the end, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts and sentenced to over 11 years in prison.
Wow, over a decade. And Balwani?
He was found guilty on all 12 counts and got almost 13 years.
So justice was served, in a way, but it's still such a crazy story.
It really is, and it makes you think about, Silicon Valley and this whole culture of move fast and break things.
Like sometimes ambition can go too far.
Yeah, and when that happens, it can have serious consequences. Theranos is a prime example of that.
So what are some of the key takeaways from all of this? Like, what can we learn from the Theranos saga?
I think one big lesson is to be skeptical, right? Don't just blindly believe the hype, especially when it comes to something as important as healthcare.
So do your research, ask questions.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge authority if you see something that seems wrong, like those whistleblowers at Theranos did. It takes a lot of courage, but it can make a huge difference.
And it also reminds us that integrity really matters. Cutting corners and ignoring ethical concerns might seem like a quick path to success, but it always catches up with you in the end.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a Silicon Valley story, right? This could happen anywhere. So we all need to be vigilant and hold people accountable.
Well said. And for anyone who wants to learn more about this whole saga, you should definitely check out Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. It's an incredible book.
Yeah, it's really well written and it goes into a lot more detail than we could cover here.
Absolutely. And that's it for our deep dive into the Theranos story. We hope you found it insightful and, maybe even a little bit cautionary. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Chio, I